G'day, I'm Kevin, and in this video I'm going to show you how I weathered an example of the Engaged Society Collett full break. This is for the Down and Dirty Weathering Competition 2, hosted by Ron's Trains and Things and sponsored by Midwest Model Railroad. Right, so a bit about the prototype. The K41 was built by the Great Western Railway to the design of Charles Collett in the 1930s. 60 examples were built, and they lasted a relatively long time for a British non-passenger carrying coaching stock vehicle, the last one being withdrawn in 1975 from revenue service, and a few more carrying on in non-revenue service for engineers' wagons right up until the 1980s. A few have been preserved at places like the Great Western Society Didcot and the Severn Valley Railway. The Engaged Society commissioned Dapol, the UK manufacturer of rolling stock in O00 N gauges, to build them a model of this particular vehicle back in 2015, and it came out in I think 7 or 8 different liveries at the time, replicating the different life patterns of this long-lived vehicle. The one that I'm going to do was the last one to be withdrawn from revenue service, number W141W, and it was withdrawn in 1975, as I said, in blue livery. Now, the BR blue livery was one of these things that, as far as modelers go, has been really hard to replicate because blues are pretty silly colour to paint a train. Actually, it fades badly. It also shows up the dirt pretty horrendously. Fortunately for the British modeler, there's plenty of photos available both in books, magazines and on the internet that give you some idea of what a BR blue liveried vehicle is going to look like. Not too many, unfortunately, in the way of the K41. I wasn't able to find any, in fact, although I believe they are out there. I was able to find a K42, of which I'll put a picture up in a minute. But other than that, I go to books and magazines for getting some sort of idea and inspiration prior to weathering. These are 2 of the books that I went to. They're quite handy as they're designed with the modeler in mind, so the pictures are very detailed and not just of the vehicle itself running in a train, but of the ends, the underframes and all sorts of bits and pieces that give you some idea of where the dirt and grime would accumulate on the ends and underneath the wagon or carriage in question. And this is the K42 picture I was able to find. As far as I can work out, the difference between a K41 and a K42 is that the rain strips were slightly different on the K42, and I believe that the interior layout may have been slightly different as well. As far as the Great Western was concerned, if there were sufficient differences in terms of layout and in terms of some of the detail parts, then a different diagram number would be issued. As far as the purpose behind the competition, the weathering of a vehicle, went, I took inspiration from Tim Shackleton's book on weathering rolling stock and an article I found in issue 1 2018 of the Engaged Society Journal on making steel roofs look old and unloved. And so to the business end of the competition. As you can see, getting the model out of the box is pretty simple. It comes in a cardboard sleeve and a plastic jewel case. The model is easily removed from the box, and to start with, you can see it's pretty shiny. The windows have got a nice glint to them as you turn it in and out of the light. So to get started, the first thing I do is put some Model Master silver paint on. I think this one's actually stainless steel lacquer, and in Queensland in February, when I was doing this, it dries quite quickly. So it's just a case of carefully paint it on. In an ideal world, I guess, you'd mask up the model and then airbrush it on. I've not been particularly successful with airbrushing anything other than straight enamels. So in the case of this, I just brushed it on fairly carefully, making sure that I gave the roof a good coverage and made it very carefully, not getting it onto the sides of the vehicle as I went. I apologise that it got a bit out of shot at this point, but I haven't really done any videoing of my work up to this point, so a few errors got in the road. I also made sure that when I did the final brushing, I went across the roof to sort of try and make it readily apparent that that was the way in which the rain would automatically go. The next step in the process, having waited for it to dry, again as I said not very long, was to put on some Humbrol 113 rust. Now this is a matte enamel, and my initial thought with this was to just paint it along the rivet lines on the roof. The prototype had a steel roof, which is why I went back to painting it a steel colour and then covering it with rust. I painted the rivet lines with the rust colour because I felt that that would be somewhere that water would accumulate and potentially cause rust to start forming, and along the seams in the roof between the panels. I put some around the ventilators as well, and this was simply a case of painting it on. Now in retrospect, I decided after I did this whole process that I hadn't really done it as true to life as it probably would. And I reread the article out of the Engaged Society Journal, and the author of that suggested that you'd be better off painting the whole roof a dry brushing technique. So I actually repeated the process later on. Having put the rust in, I then masked up the body, took, as you can see, the chassis off it to help masking it. I tried to take off the corridor connectors at the end, this being a through coach. Guard could walk around into the train from it, but they were too firmly stuck in and I didn't want to wreck them by trying to forcibly remove them. So it made it a little bit trickier masking around. Now I was masking it up because after I put the salt mask on the roof, which is the whole process that I'm going through with this, I was then going to use a rattle can of grey to paint the roof again. And that was because I felt the rattle can would work better than trying to brush on something over a salt mask that was really only just resting there because of the water. So you can see, not having the corridor connectors on would have made masking up the ends a lot easier because it would have been a flat surface rather than a lot of trimming and mucking around here. It would be nice that it was able to do it at this kind of speed, and once again apologies for it vanishing out of shot at the time. So once I was happy that everything was masked up and neat and tidy, the next process was to start looking at putting on the salt mask. Now the salt mask is a pretty simple idea. It's a case of you get some water, you get some salt. In this case it's just ordinary fine table salt, and for the Australians watching it, it's from Collett. Everybody else, well, you can get the idea. And that's a case of just put some water on where you'd again assume that rust would have formed. The principle behind the salt mask is to give you uneven edges to your rust, because rust doesn't form in straight lines. It might streak in straight lines, but it doesn't form in straight lines. So having put the water where I was happy with it, I then simply sprinkled the salt over the model. In the end, I wasn't overly thrilled with how the salt had gone with the water, so I made a bit of a practice, as you'll see in a minute, of picking up the salt with a damp brush and moving it around a bit, especially when you see how much salt there was that missed. So it's a case of making sure that the areas that I particularly wanted covered were covered. And once satisfied with all of that, the next step in the process starts, which again is let it dry a bit. Now this is the grey that I use. It's a lacquer paint, so it's going to dry pretty quick. It's German grey. It comes from Tamiya in a number of colours. That was taken outside and hit with a blast. Net result was that we've got this, and I took the mask off after the paint had dried. I was quite pleased actually. The paint spray hadn't disturbed the salt mask at all. I had feared that it might have pushed it around or reacted in some way. The original article didn't really explain how to do it. So having removed the tape, it was then a case of wash off the salt and see what had been revealed. Now what actually got revealed was, one, the camera died, and two, I wasn't overly happy with the result. So I went back and redid it. So this is the still shots that I took showing how I'd applied the rust the second time. having repainted the roof. The salt mask was done exactly the same way as previously, as was the grey paint. And then again, once it had all dried, the mask was removed, and you can see that the rust patches are much better this way around. As for the weathering of the rest of the vehicle, the sides and the ends, the chassis, the bogies, etc., these are some of the materials that I use quite regularly. The chalks are amongst the first things that I purchased for weathering probably about 20 years ago, I'd imagine. Clearly not totally worn out yet. The Tamiya weathering powders that you can get in these packs, A, B and C are the only three that I've got. I think they go up to F now, are really useful, and they will go on quite well with water, and equally valuable, can be washed off. And then I've found these washers from the Model Master range as well. I haven't got them in for this particular project, but I've also been in the past happy to use enamel paints dry brushed on, acrylic paints dry brushed on, and following some of the tips that Ron's provided in a few of his videos, I've started experimenting with oils and things like that. So the process in which I go about doing the rest of the model looks something like this. I started with putting the brown wash on. You can see there I've also got a few other paints out, but I didn't end up using them. Putting the brown wash on from the Tamiya range just to try and start building up some dirt. The good thing about a wash is that it goes into all the nooks and crannies and crevices and really brings out some of the neat little details that these models have on them in terms of rivet heads, bolt heads, builder's plate, number plates in some cases. So it's just simply brushed on, let to dry for a little bit and worked around the place. I don't load the brush up that much, maybe about a third of the brush might get dipped in the thing, but by the time I've finished rubbing it around, I've seldom gone back for more than one, maybe two extra applications. You can see there I shoved my hand in there to try and get some of it off. Then, having put the wash into the crannies, I then went over to the powders and started working them around the place. I know that using my finger tends to mean that the dirt gets moved around. I've managed to avoid putting fingerprints on though, so I'm quite pleased with that. Some people I know prefer gloves. I put a bit of a black wash over the roof. It wasn't as successful as I would have liked. In actual fact, it hid a bit too much of the effort that I'd gone in with it. I was wanting to dull it down a bit, so in the end I wiped it all off, and as you can see here, started using the chalks instead. They gave a much more subtle finish, which I was much happier with in the end. So it's just a case of playing around with different colours, having a look at the pictures that I had in those books that I had before to see about similar types of vehicles, because I wasn't able to have this type of vehicle, and in the end satisfied with the result. And there you have it. The final product, I think, looks completely different and probably a lot more realistic for a wagon running in 1975 as I've depicted it, rather than the way it looks straight out of the box. Once again, I'd like to thank Ron of Ron's Trains and Things for hosting the Down and Dirty Weathering Competition 2, and to Midwest Model Railroad for sponsoring it. I hope you've enjoyed watching it, and I hope you've learnt something from my humble efforts in trying to weather up a wagon. I've enjoyed looking at the other entries in the competition, and I'm pretty sure if you have the time to sit down and look through the others, you'll be able to get something out of them too. Thanks for watching. Cheerio.